This next panel is entitled, "It's Not Just About Benefits Fraud." And I think is a way to sort of set the stage. One of the things that came up for my friend Kim when we were in Q&A, was, referencing the old NSTIC initiative, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, which, how will I say, looking back, I think in many ways was sort of well ahead of its time in terms of what we were looking to do. But it was also the last time the US government had a digital identity strategy, and that was published back in 2011. And in some ways, it feels like we're actually backsliding, and that what we have seen from both at least the first Trump administration and also the Biden administration was a focus not on looking at digital identity holistically, but really just from how do we address it for government benefits? Whereas NSTIC at least tried to look at it at a truly national level. And so one of the reasons I wanted to put this panel together and title it this way was, I think, between, I think it was 3 years of the last administration trying to craft an executive order just on government benefits and identity. Early messaging we've been seeing from, I guess, the DOGE Commission on, well, they really had a big identity fraud problem in government benefits. Well, is it just a benefits issue, as the title would suggest? Maybe not. But I think we also want to look at it from the question of, can an effort that's focused just on reducing identity fraud and government benefits succeed if it doesn't look more holistically at the root causes of identity theft and fraud in every sector? So with that, we've got a really awesome panel. By the way, we keep hearing people are sick. This is the one everybody's healthy for now. So just make it through the next 40 minutes or so. And then we'll have lunch, which should be great, including, I believe, our legendary quinoa salad should be served. So anyways, let me just start to go right down the line, ask each of you to do a brief intro of yourself and sort of the role you play in this space.
For sure. No, thank you so much for having me. I was so honored to be invited to speak today. I started getting into this issue in the past year or so, and there's so many people in the room whose work I've read, so that's really cool for me to be able to be here. I'm Shoshana Weissman, a fellow at the R Street Institute, and I do a lot of work on age verification policy because I'm worried about First Amendment and other implications, cybersecurity implications. But when I started looking into child identity theft work, it gave me a whole nother rabbit hole to go down, which is kind of how I ended up here. So my work here focuses a lot on figuring out how is the government making child identity theft worse, not checking social security numbers for fraud and other issues before issuing them to babies, what the IRS is and isn't doing, and what states are doing to, in some cases, steal money from orphans, which I generally think is a bad thing. So I ended up here a roundabout way, but I've become really interested seeing that there's sometimes just not enough momentum in government to solve it in a measured way. And sometimes I wish government would listen to more people in this room. So that's me.
Hi, everyone, and thanks again, Jeremy. My name is Kate Griffin, and I work with the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. And over the last 6 months, we have launched the National Task Force on Fraud and Scam Prevention, which we believe is the largest coalition of organizations and agencies working to fight fraud and scams today. You can find more on just how robust that task force is at fraudtaskforce.aspeninstitute.org. But to give you a flavor of it, it is a group of law enforcement agencies, companies, consumer organizations, victims' rights organizations coming together to look at very specifically what solutions we can create, whether market-based or policy-based, to detect and prevent scams as early as possible. So look forward to telling you more about that.
Good morning, Matt Noyes with the U.S. Secret Service. I'm the Cyber Policy and Strategy Director in the Office of Field Operations. We detect and arrest people that engage in various forms of financial fraud, seize their assets so we can return to victims of fraud. And been with the Secret Service for about 13 years. Generally handle all strategy, budget, policy related to our investigative work across our 168 field offices worldwide and our cyber fraud task forces.
Hey, good morning. My name is John Carlson. I work on cybersecurity, regulation, and resilience at the American Bankers Association. But my kind of interest in this topic really goes back 3 decades in different capacities. First was working at the Office of the Controller of Currency, which is a financial regulator of national banks, and was involved in writing the Gramerly-Spliley Safeguards Regulation that protects personally identifiable information, as well as guidance on cybersecurity, authentication, third-party risk management. And then second, working in several different associations, working with financial institutions to how to better defend against cyber attacks, including information sharing, trusted information sharing amongst practitioners. And then most recently, I'm now working with Jeremy on a really interesting project under the umbrella of our Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, which is a 23-year-old public and private sector collaboration framework, which are focusing on the impact of artificial intelligence on identity and authentication.
Hi, everybody. Eva Velasquez, CEO of the ITRC, and we help consumers and victims with preventative and recovery services at no cost to them.
Great, thanks. Well, wanted to start off with a question for Matt. So earlier today, Eva and James and the ITRC team gave us a great, or maybe I'd call it a depressing overview of what breaches look like in 2024. In your role leading investigations, I know you get to see a lot of trends well before they might make it into a formal report like this. When it comes to scams and breaches, especially things tied to, compromises of identity, what are some of the trends you're seeing?
Yeah, so I'll leave it to just risks for now and the trends so we can talk to opportunities later, and so I don't hog the time available here. So fun part about the Secret Service is we get to catch the Lex Luthors, as Linda mentioned. They're usually transnational criminals. We're usually able to get them to plead guilty to multi-decade sentences, and they tend to then cooperate with us. So they give us great insight into their criminal methods and how they're going about their schemes, right? We do that by working closely with our law enforcement partners, federal, state, and local, training and equipping them and enabling them to have that reach to catch those transnational criminals. So what we are seeing from talking to them is a lot of it remains the case and is abundantly clear to folks that follow this space. The crimes are primarily financially motivated. They're obtaining identity information for use in fraud for financial gain, but it's not limited to that, right? Impersonation makes any number of fraudulent behaviors, to include very concerning and damaging ones like hoax swatting calls, more impactful. And so the risk of impersonation and how identity authentication practices play into that are widespread. Some of the most acute opportunities where I think I want to add to some of the conversation around cybersecurity is denying their ability to profit from these crimes, right? The money laundering channels they move money. Linda mentioned the challenge of money mule networks, people recruited in the US, sometimes fraud victims themselves, that are establishing bank accounts or using information that they were provided by an organizer of the scheme to then obtain money and move that money. So going after that aspect, right? It gives both us the greatest opportunity to recover assets for victims of fraud, deny the revenue to the criminals, attack the profit motive driving this ecosystem most directly. Remains at the forefront in terms of opportunities. There is an interesting piece here. So everyone that had a credit report prior to 1998, your information has effectively been public and available for criminals for identity fraud to date. And so one of the challenges we see in trying to address this space is there is an argument that why hasn't the criminal market for identity information collapsed already? There is so much information available to use in these schemes for so many people that it really begs the question of, is that more recent, that marginal additional benefit of that information of a new child born useful when you already have a wealth of information of existing people? And so it really forces us to re-examine the fundamentals of what is driving these crimes, what is the correct intervention. And the heart of it is we're relying on ineffective authentication methods that were outmoded decades ago, but we continue to do so. At the heart of that is relying on secrecy of static pieces of information that is completely incompatible with the digital world we exist in. And so every service that you as consumers sign up for that is validating you are who you are, whether that's a bank or a social media account, is fundamentally using an authentication practice that makes no sense because it's relying upon some piece of information being secret. That has to end. How to shift that becomes an incredibly challenging piece, one that the Secret Service doesn't solve, right? We catch the perpetrators, we talk to them, we understand what they're doing, but finding the solution for that, we partner closely with Congress and others to include folks in this room to try to explore that. So that's how I'd overview the threat. The numbers are right. The intersection, I love that you had the example from last week in terms of the DPRK North Korean IT workers, right? All of those tied to the fundamental identity question, where even the employment of employees in the US, we're not reasonably authenticating who someone claims to be. That they can receive a laptop computer at an address in the US, we treat as authentication. That is not authentication. That someone has a bank account in the US, we treat that as authentication. That's not authentication, right? That someone can present an identity credential tied to a US person, or in some cases, a foreign person. We treat that as authentication. And so it's across many areas where you have to address this, particularly in financial services where there's a customer due diligence obligation, because that is the pathways to then profit from this activity. And I'll save talking about digital assets and cryptocurrency and how that intersects with this for later.
Yeah, thanks. That really great overview, I think, to help frame things. I wanted to ask both Kate and John to talk more about these issues as they're seeing them in financial crimes. And Kate, if you can talk about the new work that Aspen's launched in this area.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to pick up from where Matt was. So we at the Financial Security Program came to this because of the incredibly dire financial consequences for households. If you look at if you take the FTC's estimates, which are maybe our best guess at how big we think the problem is, $400 million a day being stolen from the American people to finance transnational organized crime and further crime against American citizens. That is the story here. But as we looked into why has this not been solved, this incredibly massive problem, it became clear that you had all of these different systems that were in their own right, sort of working within their sectors, doing some things to do what they could to prevent fraud. But the ability for those systems to talk to each other is quite limited. There are legal limitations, privacy limitations, and technological limitations. And one of the key issue areas that the leaders in the task force today have asked us to solve for is how do we better share information about who the bad actors are, about who the good actors are, and be able to not only share trends about what emerging threat vectors are, but literally about who people are across platforms. And so if you take Matt's example and you think about sort of a typical scam that you might hear about that might start on a dating site or a social media site, and think about if you've ever set up a profile there, what information you were required to provide, not much, and recognize that essentially there's no way to validate that someone is who they are across a social media site, a dating site. When Google asks you what you need to set up a Gmail account, to WhatsApp, to your bank, to your crypto wallet. And so until we can able to tie that thread, we're going to be severely limited in our defenses against those criminals and in being able to find them and track them across those systems. So that's one aspect of the work that the task force is working on that I think is really critically important, and it's going to require really leadership from all of those industries and our government in order to make some real forward progress there. There's also a lot of other work happening. We have a number of working groups set up. They're all meeting this week here in Washington. So it's anti-scam week here for us. And a group today is talking about what would a national campaign look like that does a better job at making consumers aware of the threat, as well as what is better just-in-time friction that all of these different industries could put into place to alert people when they are potentially interacting with a criminal, a scammer. We have work happening to look at the relationship and better alignment between law enforcement and industry to better cooperate to find and go after these criminals, as well as work happening to actually have better measurement of the problem so that we can have a better sense of what's happening.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, I thought Matt's kind of overview was a rather sobering but realistic assessment of the scope of the problem, the challenges coming from what the good guys are trying to do in terms of investigating crimes and creating some level of a deterrence. I thought it was interesting in Linda's victim overview. I mean, that was not dealing with the digital identity. That was dealing with a physical ID that where there was not a mechanism with the bank to validate whether or not that physical ID was a credible one, a real one. We are seeing significant increases in fraud and identity theft, leveraging weak digital identities. We know that's a problem. I think the banking industry is really looking at this on several different levels. We're trying to develop better tools, better capabilities. We're trying to increase information sharing around these types of attacks, how banks can defend against those attacks. We're leveraging what we have been doing in the cyberspace around, voluntary information sharing to try to apply that also into the fraud in space. But there is a fundamental challenge that we have. It is a very complex ecosystem, and we need better partners in terms of trying to solve this challenge. I think in Linda's example showed that there were some significant challenges with law enforcement, both at mainly at the local level, in terms of how to prosecute these, creating some sort of deterrence against people that are mules that are being engaged with, international criminal enterprises or even domestic criminal enterprises. There was certainly a failure in terms of the credential and how that credential could be used. There's big challenges we have with the telecommunications industry in terms of the number of fraudulent, spoofed phone calls, texts. There's losing confidence in that as a vehicle for how to validate, someone's identity from the SMS multi-factor authentication. So we need willing partners in terms of trying to address this. And I thought Linda's comment in her overview was we need a national strategy around fraud prevention and really putting the victim at the center of it in terms of understanding what does that feel like as a victim, and really getting our government agencies, which are really stovepiped, to think about this as how do we solve this problem for individuals who are suffering from these types of crimes? Because banks clearly play an important role. They are oftentimes the line of defense, but there are other players in the ecosystem that we have to partner with in order to make that defensive mechanism effective.
I want to pivot to Shoshana, have you talk a little bit more about kids ID theft and some of the things you've been seeing there and perhaps perspectives that don't always make it into these discussions.
For sure. So I think one thing that really surprised me was that kids, or at least younger people, more often lose money than older people, although older people lose more money to fraud, which was kind of surprising to me. I just didn't expect that to be the case. But I also think that it's important to understand this in the whole context of the constant age verification debate, where a lot of lawmakers are trying to get platforms to verify user age for further protections, although really parental filters can fulfill a lot of that with limited concern to basically exposing user data. That if a parent can say, hey, come here, let's make sure our phones are connected as needed and I can control what I need, that's a lot safer than let me upload all your information to prove that you're my kid. I mean, social security numbers don't even really say you're my kid. That's why there's tax fraud where people use other kids' social security numbers and claim them as dependents. So I think it's actually really frustrating to hear lawmakers completely brush it off like child identity theft isn't that big a problem. This is, kids accessing social media is far bigger of a problem, rather than trying to see it holistically and figuring out, if you want to keep kids offline, there's other ways to talk about that. There's other methods that are a little bit safer, but there's just this big do something energy here. And I think it's really frightening to see that next to the growing problem of child identity theft. All these kids who have credit reports and they shouldn't have credit reports. In the foster care system, you also have this whole other angle where just lots of adults are constantly touching people's most sensitive information. Maybe it shouldn't be their most sensitive information, but obviously it is for at least the meanwhile. I work with a child welfare expert, and she's told me about all these kids who come out of foster care with so much fraud on their records, and they can't get loans to pay for college. They often end up in poverty. And then there's this whole other dimension here where most states apparently were stealing foster kids' Social Security funds. They can get it in various ways. Sometimes I think it's if their parent was disabled, and there's other reasons they can be left those funds. But rather than, the state's supposed to pay for foster care, that's just one of the things we have the state do. They were taking those funds and saying, well, we have to care for these kids, so we're just going to take these funds. So a whole population very likely to, or more likely than the regular population to end up homeless now doesn't have access to funds that they were given before. So you have this whole train of problems, in addition to the IRS not informing hundreds of thousands of parents that their kids' identities were being used for fraud. And I read the IG report. I was actually really shocked that no one else had noticed this, because it was kind of appalling to see. The IG said, hey, IRS, you're legally required to tell parents when this is happening. The IRS replied and said, no, kids don't pay taxes, so we don't serve them. And I was just so stunned. It wasn't a privacy issue. It wasn't some other issue they were concerned about. The IRS just didn't want to help kids because they don't pay taxes. So you have all these other issues happening here. And I think, of course, a lot of this happens to adults too. There's lots of crossover. But I think it's really important in the context of all the age verification debates, where you have lots of providers saying, oh, we can 100% verify age by scanning your face, Social Security numbers, government IDs, and one of the largest providers, and I think you pronounce it Authentics. It's spelled a little bit weird, but they were the provider for age and identity verification for Uber, TikTok, Twitter, Bumble, lots and lots of apps. They were breached for over a year and a half. There was a way to get the credentials, and you could log in and see everyone's information. Before I started working on this, and a 404 media reporter informed the company and said, hey, do you know about this breach? They're like, oh, it's solved. And the reporter said, I'm literally in the system right now. It is not solved. So I think that this adds a whole lot of complexity. It's all to say that I wish people who want age verification and identity verification for social media or app stores would talk to this community a little bit more. But I actually think it's a really big danger that we're going down that road so aggressively, with so many lawmakers not really considering the real unintended consequences, while we're also dealing with crappy identity for all intents and purposes, and so much more work that needs to be done to secure identity. And of course it affects adults too, because if kids have to verify their ages and identities, so do parents, so does anyone accessing social media. There's other issues with it, but I think from the identity angle, there's really big problems here that I don't think lawmakers understand. And I wouldn't be surprised, we're going to see more laws, whether COSA or state level laws, that don't take all of this into account.
Thanks. I think it's a great point. There's a lot of policy challenges that a lot of it comes down to identity, but people don't see it as such. And I think you can come up with these siloed solutions that will just solve one thing without thinking about the issue more holistically. I know we had a discussion a couple of years ago with Senate staff who had introduced a bill for national age verification and said, oh, Commerce Department will go and build a national age verification system. And we said, how? And their take was, well, we're on the Commerce Committee. We're not going to get into those details. But since we're on the Commerce Committee, if we get this bill through our jurisdiction, anyways, that got dropped. It didn't go anywhere. But it was a classic example, I think, of where this keeps getting sliced up into silos rather than taking a step back and looking at the overall impact. Speaking of impact, I wanted to turn to you, Eva. So we certainly heard from you and James earlier today, and also Linda. Thank you so much for bringing her to us. When I say it's not just about benefits fraud, what are some of the things that we should be considering around when and where and how people are becoming victims and the impact it has?
Oh, so many comments. And at the risk of feeling like we're going to start a new drinking game for identity authentication meetings, every time we say the word siloed, we have to take a drink. I'll try to keep that limited in my comments. But
we will serve whiskey at the reception and other beverages as well.
And then I won't keep it limited in my comments at that time. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is when I think about the re-victimization rate that I was talking about earlier and how many people are becoming re-victimized, I think it's important to realize that it's becoming rarer and rarer, at least in our call center, for people to call us with one single issue that they are experiencing in that moment. And I'm not talking about this happened and then this happened. It's this is happening, this is happening. These things are all occurring at the same time. So when we have conversations, particularly when we were having the conversations about benefits fraud, and we were speaking with a lot of folks about that huge issue when we saw it, the unemployment benefits fraud spike. And it really became the topic of conversation. And I started hearing that magical, mythical saying of we want a one-stop shop. And it made my advocate heart just go aflutter. And then they said for government. I said, oh, wait a minute. That's great. Anytime we can at least take those silos within government and compress them, that's a move in the right direction, but we still end up with a silo. Oh, I totally lied. I'm using that word over and over. But that really is, I think, one of the biggest problems. And the other piece, I think, of this equation is thinking about the way that individuals actually view their identity and the misuse of their identity. It is one thing to them. It may consist of multiple credentials, which is not a word that most people use. They may be the data subject, also not a word that regular people use. They just think of this is my identity and it is being misused and abused. And they aren't necessarily thinking about all of those different areas. They just now know that I can't go to one place other than the ITRC to get these issues resolved. Financial services, I have to call my bank, I have to call my credit card, I have to call, contact PayPal or Venmo. Oh, and now I have a criminal justice issue. Someone is using this in the commission of crime. Someone is using this to get medical goods or services. Someone is using this to get government benefits. They just don't think of their identity that way. And the more that we view this as a problem within those structures, we have to address government benefits fraud. We have to address fraud and identity misuse in financial services. I feel like we still miss the point that there's an individual at the bottom or top, either way you want to look at it, of this whole problem and this all of these transactions. And I'm really glad to see, I've heard Linda's name being mentioned since she spoke throughout the morning. That has the intended impact. I think everybody in this room and listening is maybe just today, right now, thinking about the person first while we talk about these problems. And that's definitely a move in the right direction.
Thanks. Would love to ask all of you, what are some of the broader challenges you're seeing in trying to address identity theft and fraud holistically? Do you think policymakers are starting to think about this issue in the right way? I know we have one here. We'll have a fireside chat with Congressman Bill Foster just after lunch. But beyond Bill, how are we doing?
Everybody's shocking for it.
I'll start out and put a few things on the table. There's probably a longer conversation we could have about that. I think a couple of things that I've noticed in this conversation. First is that the actual tie here to transnational organized crime and national security is not as well known as it should be. That should be the conversation we are having. The criminals perpetrating these crimes are using those funds to fuel other illicit crimes. It is a national priority that we address this. So I would say sort of the conversation about what this threat level is needs to go more in that direction. There's some more, I think, education and awareness raising that we need to do about that. I think the other issue here too is, listen, I have met hundreds of incredible leaders working every day on this issue. And they will all tell you the same problem, which is it's not just silos, but it is too many places. If you are a victim and this happens to you, do you know where to report? No, you don't, because there's 18 different options for where to tell somebody that this happened to you. And by the way, why should you report? Because will anything happen once you do? Unclear. And so the sort of consumer trust in what's happening here is a little bit broken in terms of there not being an ability always to actually have action happen when this kind of crime has been committed. And so I think concerted effort to really look at streamlining that and saying there needs to be a single way of victims reporting these crimes so that we have a single data source and a way to then work effectively and funnel cases to law enforcement. I'm sure Matt has opinions about what that would look like. We've been talking with him and all the other agencies about that. For all of these agencies or different industry silos to be able to share information and work together on how they combat that threat. So really just sort of the convergence and coming together of this in a single place, I think is something that we need to start talking seriously about. There are definitely folks who have pointed to the National Center for Exploited and Missing Children as an example of a kind of system that might work applied in this scenario. But those are the kinds of, I think, real kind of practical solutions that we're advancing in the task force and that we need to be talking more about with policymakers.
So I just, I mean, the House Financial Services hearing held committee, excuse me, held a great hearing in September, focusing on the transnational criminal networks engaged in these fraud schemes, which I is the important framing, as Kate highlighted, of understanding the nature of the threat. You know, I work for a law enforcement agency. I voted with my feet in terms of where I go to work every day. While I see law enforcement as a necessary action, it's not sufficient, right? There's a range of actions needed. And so speaking just in terms of advancing the law enforcement work and in the very particular context of asset recovery for victims, Secret Service, we're recovering hundreds of millions every year for victims of fraud. We're preventing, through voluntary actions with financial institutions, billions in fraud losses. Enabling that work, right? That has the most direct impact in terms of financially on victims, has the most direct impact on the criminal networks, reinvesting the proceeds of these crimes to further their criminal activities. Advancing that work, we need action from the judiciary committees. And getting that attention and focus has been a challenge. There's a range of transnational criminal threats, and appreciating that in this context, in cybersecurity, in fraud, these are people outside the US that never have to enter the US, yet are causing substantial hundreds of billions of dollars of damages to the US. That is a different context of transnational crime than some folks are used to framing it in. They're focused on people that are in the US harming Americans. Understanding that context, that distinction of transnational crime likely causing the greatest economic damage to the US involves people, the leaders of which never enter the US willingly. That is a different framing, and we need that understood so that we can then work constructively with the judiciary committees to make meaningful action that enables us to get the leaders of these operations, the Lex Luthors, as Linda called them, and that's what allows us to have the greatest disruptive impact, recover the most assets for Americans, and deprive the resources that fuels this illicit economy.
Yeah, let me just say three things. One, we do have regulatory requirements for certain industries. I know financial services, having been a former regulator, as well as someone who works with financial institutions to address some of the regulatory challenges we face. But there are limits to the regulation. I mean, right now we're dealing with a plethora of cyber incident notification requirements from numerous government agencies, whether it's their financial banking agencies, whether it's DHS with their, at some point will be finalized rule on incident notification and ransomware payments, the SEC's requirement for publicly traded companies to notify within 4 business days of a cyber incident, and then all the state-based notification, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley safeguards requirement to notify customers. So there's no shortage of regulatory requirements, but there are limits to how far it can go. And what we're seeing, where I see, is that we've really reached that limit because some of our chief information security officers are spending up to 50% of their time on regulatory compliance activities as opposed to hardcore defense activities. So that needs to be a little bit rebalanced. Second point is I fully support the notion that was addressed in the earlier panel about carrots and incentives. They are far more effective. And if you can align that with tools that government agencies can provide, like definitely support the work that NIST is doing on the mobile digital driver's license. Let's get those things out to the states. Let's get those out and being used by practitioners. And then the third thing, which is I think going to be the most difficult, is getting alignment in terms of the mission and the focus of multiple government agencies that have a role in this space. I know from years ago, we worked on a project with support from DHS, from the White House, to really get the Social Security Administration to treat its SSN number as an identifier that is really important for financial institutions. And it took us a lot of effort to try to get them to enact a consent-based verification system just to give us basic information. Is this Social Security number with this name a valid person? Or is this person dead? So that we know whether or not we can move forward with any sort of transactions. And I think that needs to really go to the telecommunications providers because they are really the front line for the consumer. And we need to find ways to address the spoofing, the fraudulent phone calls, the fraudulent checks, because consumers, including myself, I don't have a lot of confidence in the texts I receive because I don't know if that number is aligned with a real person versus someone who's a fraudster. So I've gotten very comfortable with the report junk on all the text messages, which for me is coming in at like 30% junk to, the rest are real. And that's really got to change.
John, you mean all of these impossibly beautiful women who are texting me and trying to talk to me about cryptocurrency aren't real?
That's a nice segue, Jeremy, to the one thing that I want to add, which is consumer education. Just one part of the investment that we need to be making is a little bit of time and effort in actually letting the people whose identities are being impacted know how this works and what we expect of them, because it is a shared stakeholder responsibility.
So I have, I'll yell about lawmakers a little bit more than my co-panelists have. So one example of someone really great here is Senator Ron Wyden. He's always very interested in these issues and he really understands them, I think, better than just about any other member. There are some others that are really great, but he's always out there on it, which I appreciate. But on the other side, so it's kind of funny to say in a room like this, but over the years, I always thought it was kind of fun messing with scammers and trying to get their hopes up. So I spent actually a good chunk of time doing it. I tweeted out, everyone loved them because they were funny, but I actually learned a lot doing that, like figuring out what they were trying to get from me, where they wanted me to go. So I learned some of that. I didn't think it was going to be valuable. I just thought it was going to be funny. But over the last couple of years, while lawmakers have been doing other social media laws, variations of this, so know that this is just a really broad category, but various laws that amend 230 to sometimes prevent content moderation, sometimes to force it. Other forms of that basically to tell platforms what they can and can't do for moderation. But I kept trying to remind lawmakers, romance scams start as fully legal text. Hey, how are you? Hello, my dear, is a common one. That's legal. There's nothing, you can't do anything about that. And there's no way platforms would know that that's bad. It could be someone's grandma who's like getting used to like to using social media. It could be someone who doesn't know English very well. There's tons of people, or some people just talk like that. But a lot of it is fully innocent texts. And then they're like, oh, find me on WhatsApp, find me on some other app. And when you don't allow platforms to go after that, it actually becomes dangerous because then you're enabling these scams. But whenever I brought this up to lawmakers, they just didn't seem to care because going after big tech was sexy. It was always frustrating because I was trying to show them you could really hurt people if you don't allow platforms to filter here. Not all platforms do enough. Not a lot of them do it well, but they have, their transparency reports where you can see how much they're moderating. And I think a lot of, there's more interest here in going after big tech and making them the enemy than there is in solving scam problems. There's a lot of, and I know a lot of this is really genuine. Like, I'm not saying they're bad or wrong for wanting it, but there's a lot of just energy for going after tech and not a lot in solving other problems. And also they're trying to, of course, solve for kids online, thinking kids are online too much, on social media too much. But as part of all of this, they just keep missing. I know it sounds funny to say it too, but the trees through the forest, all the little pieces that you can mess up when you do this wrong, from stopping platforms from going after scams or even holding them liable. So a scammer could sue a platform saying, you got in the way of my free speech, which is wild. Or having every person in America give their social security number and government ID to age verification companies or social media platforms, which for a while included TikTok. Like TikTok was covered by these bills. If you have national security concerns there, it's ridiculous. Like, oh, let's make sure TikTok has all our age verifying information. There's just so much missed opportunity to do good here. Although there is some interest from some of these same lawmakers on these issues. In the last 6 to 12 months or so, I've seen a lot of bills covering different angles I've been focused on, just less broad interest from Senate and Congress. So there is interest, but I think the bigger interest in going after tech sometimes misses problems that we can solve or at least make progress on. And I wish that they would focus on solving certain things before doing certain things, like giving everyone's IDs and socials and other information to every platform someone has to log into.
Thanks. So we are at time, unfortunately. I have so much more I'd like to talk about. One final question before lunch, lightning round for the panel. If you had one recommendation to pass on to policymakers on identity issues, what would it be? What can government do to help?
I think mine is just like tell the IRS to tell parents when their kids' identities are stolen. I think that would help probably.
Raise the threat level priority of this issue.
End SMS one-time passwords. It should not exist.
Improve government issued credentials.
Remember the victims first in everything you do.
Great. That was awesome. All right. Now it's time for lunch. We'll have buffet set up outside. Thanks for the panel, by the way. Sorry.